Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you may be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Thursday, November the 4th, 2021. Here, let me make another adjustment. There we go. First topic, why does this keep happening? Greatest mystery of our times. This is from People magazine. Braves GM Alex Anthropoulos unable to attend a team's World Series win after testing positive for COVID-19. Alex Anthropoulos was previously general manager of the Toronto Blue Jays. Speaking to ESPN, Anthropoulos, 44, said he decided not to disclose his COVID-19 status until after the big game to avoid any distractions. I want to keep it quiet to not take any chance that I would be a distraction before the end of the series, he said. I'm totally fine. I watched with the whole family at home. Very happy. In another interview with Sportsnet, Anthropoulos said that he was fully vaccinated and reiterated that repeated, as others would write, that he didn't feel sick. He said after traveling with the team to Houston for Game 1, he tested the next day and found out he was positive. I thought it was a joke, he admitted, of testing positive. Yes. Seemed kind of joke-like because you get double vaxxed and then you are immune to the virus. Or are you? And we just keep finding more and more of these stories, and I'm going to keep leading with it because we all have to be vaccinated so that we won't get the virus. But when people are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and they get the virus, it's here's another one closer to home for Canadians. And this is from CTV News, Christy Somos and Anthony Vasquez-Petty. Pittsburgh Penguins star center Sidney Crosby and defenseman Brian Dumoulin have entered the NHL's COVID-19 protocol after testing positive for the virus, the team announced Wednesday. Crosby is experiencing mild symptoms while Dumoulin appears asymptomatic, according to the team. Crosby's positive COVID-19 test comes less than a week after his season debut, after missing the team's first 7 games recovering from surgery on his left wrist. Now, this story and the story that almost every other story was based on says, despite the overwhelming majority of players being vaccinated, the Penguins roster has struggled with the coronavirus this season. Crosby and Dumoulin are the 7th and 8th players on the team to enter the league's COVID-19 protocol since training camp in September. Well, elsewhere, I found a global news story which referred to Sidney Crosby as another so-called breakthrough case of COVID-19. So I guess he's fully vaccinated then. Tremendous mystery there. Because we know, because the experts have told us, and the experts are never wrong, that everyone must get vaccinated. Even 5-year-olds must get vaccinated in order to stop people from becoming infected. So what else is at play here? Some sort of miasma? Is it time to panic? Well, according to the German government, the answer is yes. This is from Agence France-Presse. The World Health Organization expressed grave concern Thursday over the rising pace of coronavirus infections in Europe as Germany registered its biggest daily increase since the start of the pandemic. We are once again at the epicenter, WHO Europe Director Hans Kluge told a press conference. He warned that according to one reliable projection, the current trajectory would mean another 500,000 COVID deaths by February. Alarm bells were ringing, especially in Germany, the European Union's most populous country, where the number of new cases over the past 24 hours soared to almost 34,000 on Thursday, an all-time high, according to the Robert Koch Institute Health Agency. Meanwhile, Britain on Thursday became the first country in the world to approve the use of Merck's anti-COVID pill to treat patients suffering from mild to moderate coronavirus infections. So I'm going to look for something here. Vaccinated, that's what I'm looking for, that word. German Health Minister Jens Spahn said on Wednesday that the country of 83 million was facing a, quote, massive pandemic among the unvaccinated, and that intensive care beds were starting to run out in some regions. Okay. The WHO blamed a combination of insufficient vaccination rates and a relaxation of preventative measures like mask wearing and social distancing. Hospital admission rates were higher in countries where fewer people are vaccinated, Kluge said. Oh, you mean like in Israel and Ireland and England and Scotland? Countries like that? Over the past 7 days, Russia, a country with strong vaccine hesitancy, has led the rise with 8,162 deaths. Vaccinations. Oh, despite vaccines being widely available, just 66.9% of the German population was fully inoculated as of Thursday, according to official figures. Outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel has called Germany's coronavirus trend very worrying and signaled that she is in favor of tougher curbs targeting the unvaccinated. Health Minister Spahn has too called for stricter measures, including more thorough checks at establishments and events where people need to show proof of vaccinations, recovery from COVID, or a recent negative test before entering. He also urged all vaccinated Germans to get booster shots after 6 months. So in terms of cases, and deaths, it doesn't seem to be much difference in countries where almost everyone is vaccinated, or countries where, as in Germany, only 3/4 of the population is vaccinated. But wait, there's this. Numbers. There are just numbers all over the place. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. The Italian Higher Institute of Health has drastically reduced the country's official COVID death toll by over 97% after changing the definition of a fatality to someone who died from COVID rather than with COVID. Italian newspaper Il Tempo reports that the institute has revised downward the number of people who have died from COVID rather than with COVID from 130,000 to under 4,000. Yes, you read that right. It turns out 97.1% of deaths hitherto attributed to COVID were not due directly to COVID, writes Toby Young. All the other Italians who lost their lives had from between 1 and 5 pre-existing diseases. Of those aged over 67 who died, 7% had more than 3 comorbidities, and 18% at least 2. According to the Institute, 65.8% of Italians who died after being infected with COVID were ill with arterial hypertension, that is to say, high blood pressure. 23.5% had dementia, 29.3% had diabetes, and 24.8% had atrial fibrillation. Add to that, 17.4% had lung problems, 16.3% had cancer in the last 5 years, and 15.7% suffered from previous heart failures. The Institute's new definition of a COVID death means that COVID has killed fewer people in Italy than the average bout of seasonal flu. If a similar change were made by other national governments, the official COVID death toll would cut the margin by a margin of greater than 90%. Watson comments, don't expect many others to follow suit, though, given that governments have invested so much of their authority in hyping the threat posed by the virus. For example, behavioral psychologists in the UK worked with the state to deliberately, quote, exaggerate the threat of COVID via unethical and totalitarian methods of propaganda to terrorize the public into mass compliance. And this was a story reported in May of this year by the Telegraph, which is not known as a conspiratorial organ. And in American news, This is from the Daily Mail. Caitlin Corral. Republicans sue to stop Biden's unconstitutional plan to fine businesses up to $14,000 for unvaxxed workers. GOP and unions say rules will lead to staff shortages and make Americans choose between the shot and putting food on the table. Violators will face a fine no more than $13,653 for each employee who is not vaccinated or tested weekly, and repeat offenders will face a fine of up to $136,532. Joe Biden failed to shut down the virus like he promised. He couldn't do his job, so now he wants you to lose yours. Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel wrote in a statement regarding the new rule. She continued, while I am pro-vaccine, the Biden administration does not have the authority to force hardworking Americans to choose between being vaccinated and providing for their families. That's why the RNC is suing the Biden administration over this unlawful vaccine mandate and will maintain every legal option to fight this authoritarian overreach. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announced Thursday he would join a lawsuit with Georgia, Alabama, and private plaintiffs seeking to nullify Biden's rule. We've got to stand up, the Republican Trump ally said during a press conference in Tallahassee. We've got to stand up for the constitutional order. Missouri's Attorney General Eric Schmidt and Arizona's Attorney General Mark Brnovich both announced Thursday their intentions to file lawsuits against the Biden administration on Friday. Constitutional. Does it really matter, practically, whether this is constitutional or not? In terms of health matters, our governments have become post-constitutional. And from Politico, this is Victoria Colliver. San Francisco will soon require children as young as 5 to show proof of COVID-19 vaccination to enter certain indoor public spaces like restaurants, entertainment venues, and sporting events, public health officials said this week. The local mandate already requires children and adults over the age of 12 to show proof they are vaccinated before entering those places. Now, city health officials are planning to extend the health order to children ages 5 to 11, the group newly eligible for the shot. San Francisco health officer Susan Phillip said the requirement won't kick in for at least 2 months. I'm sure you've noticed how many of these latrine wallas are female, and I do not think that that is insignificant. I suppose you could call it part of what is described in a piece I'll talk about later as the mommy industrial complex. Of course, many of these latrine wallas do not, in fact, have children. And this is from the we already talked about the Merck antiviral pill. That sure was approved in a hurry, wasn't it? A real hurry. Just like the Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. There's a fellow in Canada, a professor called Amir Attaran, who is one of my least favorite people in this country. But this is a strange story from Devika Desai at the National Post. Twitter suspended the account of University of Ottawa professor Amir Attaran after his use of a seemingly violent turn of phrase in a tweet addressed to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The tweet is part of a longer thread posted this week criticizing the Liberals' slowness to approve vaccines for Canadian children. And as I have joked before, and this seems less and less of a joke with each passing day, I figure that the experts are going to start demanding that babies be vaccinated in utero. Health Canada knew a half a year ago this was coming. Attaran wrote on Twitter. Trudeau should be tarred and feathered for putting child lives in danger, he continued, tagging Conservative leader Erin O'Toole and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. Late Wednesday evening, Attaran said Twitter had sent him a notice that said his account would be restored if he deleted the offending tweet. Attaran said he would sleep on the platform's request. The account appeared to be reactivated, but Attaran had not posted to it. Uh, he responded that he found the ban absurd and was extremely disappointed. Quote, "This was obviously a metaphor." Yes, indeed. Everyone understands that when there's a call for someone to be tarred and feathered, it is metaphorical. It is not an actual threat. But apparently Twitter does not understand that, or that is to say, its algorithms do not. Yes, this is a story. Manisha Krishnan in Vice. People tell me that Vice used to have interesting stories on it. Now they are increasingly, again, from an alternative universe, even wackier than the New York Times. Drug users are nostalgic for old school heroin as fentanyl takes over. In many former heroin strongholds in the US and Canada, the opioid is disappearing, fueling fentanyl overdoses and prompting some users to push for a, wait for it, renaissance. Yes, a renaissance of shooting up junk. Remember the good old days? Yeah, the good old days of heroin. For nearly 5 years, Daniel Garrett made 2-hour round trips, sometimes twice a day, from Martin to Jackson, Tennessee, so he could buy heroin, anywhere from half a gram to a gram each time. The rides along a highway that passed through a string of small towns often took place at night, which was dangerous because of the failing headlights on his 2007 black Nissan Sentra, and because Garrett made the trips home high. One time he nodded off, crossed over a median, and skidded 200 feet. Yeah, remember the good old days of heroin? Finally, this March, the 26-year-old copywriter moved to Jackson to be closer to the source of the drugs he wanted. But once there, he noticed heroin was becoming harder and harder to find. Then it disappeared altogether. I saw it pop up maybe 3 or 4 times, but for no longer than 3 or 4 days in a row, Garrett told Vice News. He hasn't come across any heroin since September. It's been entirely replaced with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's up to 50 times more potent. Fentanyl sucks, Garrett said. It doesn't last long. It doesn't provide you much euphoria. It doesn't offer me much utility. It's just fentanyl around now, and I fear it's going to be like that forever. Yes, the old order changeth. Is this goodbye to heroin? Once one of the most popular and notorious illicit opioids, heroin is disappearing from drug markets across North America in some places where it was once widely available, like Vancouver, British Columbia. Dealers and users told Vice News there's no heroin to be found, and they want it back, not just because it's their drug of choice, but also because its replacement, fentanyl, is killing people in droves. We are missing the opportunity. It is going by so fast, said Erica Thompson, executive director of British Columbia and Yukon Association for Drug War Survivors, a drug user advocacy group. Is this goodbye to heroin? A drug user advocacy group. Golly, I wonder where their funding comes from. And let's see. Let's go. Let's take a first look at the chat. And hello to Head McNeck, Anran, Kontiki Roulette, Dawn from Beyond. Yes, Head McNeck got kicked off Twitter for 12 hours because their stupid algorithm doesn't recognize metaphors. Hello to Emma Kelly's Earth, Palpcasso 88, Chogokin 666, who says, please purchase on Amazon. Hello to Dan, Dawn from Beyond. Who says FYI, Rush Limbaugh's radio show taken over by the Clay and Buck Show, which is the #1 most popular radio show in the country. Really great stuff, very heartening. Alex Berenson is a frequent guest. Anran says, I believe Pat Kane of the Blackhawks had the Rona too. Brandon Smith says, routine breakthrough infections. Kontiki Roulette says, they were truthful about HIV, so why would they lie about this? Good point. A good point. Hello to Dan, who says experts are omniscient, of course, and Contraco, who says the vaccine works the more you believe in it. Yes, obviously, there must be a faith component to this. Emmett Kelly's Earth says the humors are unbalanced. And, okay, Who else do we have here? David Wright, taking on all this COVID by KMG might be his exit from YouTube. Hello, Rumble. I'm pretty close to Odyssey now. It should be done over the weekend. Hello to Professor Paul, who says, Gott mit uns. Kontiki Roulette mentions Iceland. No, I will continue. This is not my farewell to YouTube. The experts are always right, okay? This is my official position. The experts say it must be right, and they tell you get vaccinated twice and then a third booster. Well, it is your moral duty to do so because the experts have made their judgment. Hello to Quacholango. And let's see, Merkin. That's a funny word. Hello, and who else do we have here? Unconstitutional, asks Enron. I believe that is John Roberts' job to decide. My Trail of Disgrace says, make sure to follow KMG on Odyssey and Rumble. If you've amassed any LBC on Odyssey, you might not even realize you have done so. Please donate it. Yes, I second that. Thank you. Could this crash the U.S. economy, says Palcasso88. Could be. Contra Costa's authorities don't like comparisons. No. William Hicks says, last time I checked, June average age of death attributed to by COVID-19 in the U.S. was 78 years old. Overall life expectancy before the pandemic was also 78 years. Last time I checked for Alberta, which is wicked because of Jason Kenney and Dina Hinshaw, the average age of death for, a year and a half had been 80. It has now dropped dramatically to 79. Hello to Dionysus. Enron says the Constitution has been a dead letter for most of our lives. True. David Wright quotes Joseph Brand, the Constitution poses no threat to our present form of government. Indeed. Contra Costa says Democrats have painted themselves into a corner with this hysteria. Well, they've managed something incredible that, of course, everyone who died last year and up to January 23rd or whatever, this was entirely Donald Trump's fault. Never mind the governors and the mayors. No, it was all Donald Trump's fault. Donald Trump, of course, had authorized warp speed vaccines, and they were ready. They were ready before the election. The drug companies neglected to publicize this information. And Joe Biden said that he had a plan to get COVID-19 under control. So suddenly COVID-19 became Biden's problem, and Biden embraced the vaccine he hugged it so tightly that now people have forgotten that all the COVID-19 deaths used to be blamed on Donald Trump, and COVID-19 is very much the millstone around Biden's neck. Hello to John S. and Yo Mama. And John S. says, I tuned in a bit late to KMG, see the National File story about Biden mandating the vax to smaller businessmen. I talked about that, not from National File, but I believe from the Daily Mail. Hello to Jeffrey Pye. Quebec nurses managed to get the government off its back. Looks like a few dominoes are falling. Well, the same thing has happened. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, has said that he will not force hospital employees to get vaccinated because they can't afford to lose them. And speaking of constitutions, official or unofficial, there's a grim piece by Mary McGreechan in The Conservative Woman, which you can find at conservativewoman.co.uk. Begins with a quotation from Lewis Carroll. The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. It must come sometimes to jam today, Alice objected. If Lewis Carroll were alive, he might have penned Alice's Adventures in Lockdown, channeling the nightmare under which we now live into an amusing, if dystopian fantasy. Or perhaps Carroll would have concluded that no work of fiction could match the absurd reality of the COVID years. Alice's insistence that it must sometimes be jammed today mirrors the forlorn hope that many still cling to. A permanent Freedom Day, the old normal, a restoration of democracy and civil liberties, all must surely return at some point in the future. Yet for almost 2 years, we have been tormented like Tantalus, that which we desire being just out of reach, resembling a donkey chasing the carrot which dangles in front of its head, our freedom always remaining frustratingly unattainable. The granting, withdrawing, limiting, releasing, and removing of our freedoms has been referred to as gaslighting, psychologically manipulating the British people to the extent that we doubt our own sanity. If we did this, stopped doing that, tried harder, obeyed to the letter, then our old lives would be returned to us. As the wonderful Neil Oliver has stated, we now live in a version of an abusive relationship with our government. To escape this abuse, we must realize one thing. Our government will not voluntarily allow this pandemic to end. Once this is accepted, then you know that it is pointless to highlight flawed data, challenge illogical arguments, and ridicule nonsensical rules. More important, you understand it is futile to passively wait for the government to release its tyrannical grip on our liberty. In hindsight, it is clear that transforming temporary restrictive rules into a permanent state of authoritarianism formed very quickly after announcing the infamous 3 weeks to flatten the curve. After almost 6 weeks of imprisonment, Dominic Raab announced that the lockdown would remain in place for a further 3 weeks. But Raab promised there is light at the end of the tunnel. Turns out this light was the tyranny train hurtling down the tracks towards our democracy. Needless to say, by May the 7th, it was still jammed tomorrow. But the government had come up with a brand new wheeze called local lockdown, with the inhabitants of Leicester having the dubious honor of being its first prisoners. The city's residents, who had thought freedom almost theirs, would have to wait just a bit longer. It was now apparent to those who chose to see it that the regaining of our freedoms would be continually kicked a little further down the road. By September, the route to Freedom Day was now only available with a rule of 6 and a 10 p.m. curfew. All that was missing was an electronic ankle tag. 3 tiers, regional restrictions, and circuit breakers lay between Britons and their freedom several weeks later, but Boris Johnson announced that he was optimistic that this will feel very different and better by the spring. It did not. In fact, it felt very familiar, with Matt Hancock telling the House of Commons in March 2021 that vaccines meant we have freedom on the horizon. By this point, the sane amongst us had given up listening. So when the scheduled Freedom Day on June the 21st was postponed, only the truly gullible could have been surprised. Fast forward to this October and Johnson's denial of another lockdown. It was not on the cards, said the man who has as much credibility as the love child of Lady Macbeth and Iago. If you still believe the government will graciously restore our pre-COVID lives, then frankly, you are either mentally challenged or you have an agenda. Like Alice, I can believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, but this or any other government will relinquish the powers COVID legislation has granted is not one of them. The rule is freedom tomorrow and freedom yesterday, but never freedom today. It must come sometimes to freedom today, Alice objected. No, Alice, it will never be freedom today. And again, this is a piece by Mary McGreechan at the excellent site, The Conservative Woman, which you can find at conservativewoman.co.uk. Once again, the experts, they're always right. And William Briggs at wmbriggs.com agrees. We are not yet in a full or complete expertocracy. That form of government is still in competition with the oligarchy, currently also gaining strength, and the old capitalism system, in which the parliament or Congress is supposed to hold ultimate power, withers. Congress isn't entirely ornamental, but it is becoming so. Here are some for instances that you already know. Congress has on paper the power to declare war. Do they? Or do the experts in the executive do it? Congress has on paper the power to tax and spend. It seems they do. Yet Congress creatures largely farm out the laws they write to experts, mainly lobbyists in the employ of oligarchs. Congress is not yet powerless, Some small laws created in the traditional way, designed for the good of the old system, slip by, but these are decreasing. Too many of their laws are now mere guidelines, tasking some agency to create the actual de facto laws. These agencies are staffed by experts. Voting is still a thing, but limited. The left certainly becomes hysterical about voting, such as insisting people can vote illegally. This means elections still matter to some extent, not in the same sense and force as, say, a century ago, but they can make small differences, especially at smaller levels of governance. Yet all this is fading. The expertocracy gains in strength. Here today is one small proof of this: the call for formalizing the governing role of what we used to call monopolies. Bloomberg says, give Amazon and Facebook a seat at the United Nations. And from the original story, it's getting harder to distinguish brands from nation states. The resemblance is not simply semiotics. Logos, flags, anthems, jingles, taglines, mottos, mission statements, constitutions, founder stories, official histories, terms and conditions, legal codes. Customers, citizens, shareholders, legislators, boards of directors, executives, chairmen, monarchs, CEOs, presidents, and oversight boards, judges, or even size, though the comparisons are startling. The call is what is important, to Briggs comments, to say that these large entities, resembling as they do more in this presently small countries, creating de facto laws and enforcing them, should be treated as other governing bodies, is to acknowledge the expertocracy and in part the oligarchy. Corporations are not strictly oligarchies, even if they are monopolies, because they are woke. That they are woke shows that it is not capitalists in charge of these entities, but experts in marriage with oligarchs. I won't repeat all the reasons why this is so. For that, read Why Corporations Are Woke. These corporations, while wielding substantial power, are still subject to the rule of experts as the rest of us. Old-style capitalists in days long gone had vastly more freedom to do what they wanted and to buy congressional votes. New-style expert-led companies, even if owned by oligarchs, are often forced to bow to their own employees' demands which are fomented by experts. Now for the resources these entities control. Walmart employs roughly the population of Botswana. Microsoft's market cap is greater than Brazil's GDP. FedEx has 5 times more planes than Air India. That's a lot of muscle. Then this recognition. If this all sounds a tad whimsical, comparing gadflies to Goliaths, it may be because of the cultural dominance of the Westphalian system, under which the global balance of power has been envisioned since 1648 as a mosaic of centrally controlled and culturally unified nation states, each wielding a monopoly of force inside mutually recognized borders. Briggs comments, the expertocracy, thanks to English and academia, is world-spanning. Papers are written still in other languages, but make no mark unless recast in English. And it is universities that staff both old-style governments and woke corporations. Borders are a hindrance, which is why the expertocracy views them with disdain. They also make little sense. Well, this slogan does. Knowledge has no borders. Of course, expert definition of knowledge differs from the logical. And then came the gift of the Corona doom, in which the true power of experts became apparent. These entities are not in complete control. I do not claim that, but the experts in these entities have substantial power. Using de facto laws, they can and do purge their enemies, including sitting presidents. They can't do everything. They can't start or wage wars, but they can direct the flow of much political activity, including warmongering. I don't think anybody knows how this will all shake out in 50 years' time, but if I had to guess, something resembling the New World Order, something much more, but not entirely global, will result. And again, this is William Briggs at wmbriggs.com. And here's a sad story from the Tablet magazine. And hang on just a sec. And this is by Ann Bauer. And it's called, I Have Been Through This Before. Don't wear a mask, you must wear a mask. Buy a pulse oximeter, stock up on Tylenol, vitamin D, Pepsid. Whisper so you don't spit, stand 6 feet away from others. No 10, wear gloves, wear 2 masks. Open the windows, close the schools. The dizzying madness of COVID and the reliance on guru-like experts has been eerily familiar. And she begins with a consideration of Bruno Bettelheim, a once vastly influential intellectual who it appears was an almost complete fraud. In April 1939, as the result of a backdoor bribe, a 35-year-old lumber baron named Bruno Bettelheim was released from the Buchenwald concentration camp on the condition that he leave Germany and never return. In addition to running his family sawmills, Bettelheim had earned a degree in art history and, like many Austrians of the time, dabbled in psychoanalysis and read a bit of Freud. His wife had once cared for an emotionally disturbed child in their home. When he arrived as a refugee in the US, he used these random details to remake himself as an expert in human behavior. A small man with a striking Viennese accent and manner, he believed he had valuable psychological insights from the 11 months he'd spent inside Dachau and Buchenwald. Back in 1938, when Bettelheim was imprisoned, these were primarily work camps where prisoners were divided, stripped of their possessions, then beaten and herded like animals by the guards. Bettelheim noted that the men most damaged by alienation and violence, the ones who gave up hope, had a similar affect. They avoided eye contact, rocked and muttered, and gazed at distant objects. He felt he had witnessed what it takes to break a person's mind. Bettelheim's first job in the United States was as research assistant at the University of Chicago, studying high school art curricula. He divorced his wife, who had also emigrated, and taught briefly. In 1943, he published a paper titled Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations, claiming to have studied more than 1,500 concentration camp prisoners. Legendary General and future President Dwight D. Eisenhower praised the work. Overnight, Bettelheim became a doctor and a star. On the strength of that paper, his false claim to have worked with Sigmund Freud, and his status as an intellectual and refugee from Hitler's Germany, Bettelheim was made full professor of psychology and director of the Sonia Shankman Orthogenic School for Emotionally Disturbed Children at the University of Chicago in 1944. Once established at the school, he won a grant from the Ford Foundation to start a program specifically for autistic children. Parents from around the country sought his help for their children who were mute, withdrawn, unable to follow directions, prone to stimming, that is, gazing at an object or blinking rapidly in delight, self-harming, or failing to toilet train. In the mid-50s, Bettelheim developed a new theory of autism based on his 1943 paper and the passing remark of a researcher named Leo Kanner, who said autistic children never defrost the refrigerator mother. Bad parenting, like imprisonment in a Nazi work camp, was an extreme situation, Bettelheim said. He characterized the mothers of children in his program as cold, distant, abusive, and uncaring, like domestic SS guards. Though no studies were done to back up this hypothesis, his theory that rejecting mothers cause autism became the accepted science of the time. In his 1967 book, The Empty Fortress, Bettelheim wrote, quote, "Infants, if totally deserted by humans before they have developed enough to shift for themselves, will die. And if their physical care is enough for survival, but they are deserted emotionally or are pushed beyond their capacity to cope, they will become autistic," unquote. Bettelheim enjoyed decades as a media darling, appearing on television. He was a regular on the Dick Cavett Show, and serving as top expert for newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, which credited him with, quote, originating many of the techniques and principles of modern child psychiatry, unquote. Woody Allen gave the pop psychiatrist a cameo as himself in the film Selig. Commonweal magazine published an article titled The Holy Work of Bruno Bettelheim. Commonweal is a Catholic magazine. He also wrote a series of world-famous best-selling books. The refrigerator mother theory of autism became gospel, not just among psychiatrists, but in the zeitgeist. It made sense and was easy to grasp. Better, it turned a mysterious and heartbreaking condition into a simple problem of who was to blame. People rallied behind the idea that cold mothers caused autism because it gave them comfort. Mothers whose children developed normally knew it was because they were good. Fathers and other relatives of autistic children were off the hook. Even desperate bad mothers embraced the idea, believing that if they could fix themselves, their children would be cured. Finally, an answer. They needed to sign up for intense psychotherapy and send their autistic children to live with other families or in residential programs. Some mothers were advised to rehome their healthy children as well, lest their refrigerator qualities leak over and spoil another young mind. Many complied. Occasionally, families would reject the diagnosis and their children would be taken by force. Reports were made, psychiatric teams mobilized. They showed up at the homes of autistic children, packed their bags, and removed them while guards held off the screaming, protesting mothers who'd been deemed unsuitable. Bettelheim called this process parentectomy, a sad but necessary practice that would help autistic kids be cured. Many were taken to the orthogenic school he ran, where they stayed for up to a dozen years. It wasn't until 1990, after Bettelheim's death by suicide at 86, that residents and staff from the school began talking about his rages, name-calling, constant lying, and abuse. I would characterize the atmosphere at the orthogenic school at that time as the beginning of a cult, with Dr. B as the cult leader, wrote a former counselor, W.B., in a letter to the Chicago Reader in July 1990. By that point, almost 50 years of damage had been done, during which any clinician who came up with a different diagnosis or questioned Bettelheim's practices suffered immediate and devastating professional consequences. In the orthogenic school, psychiatrist Richard Kaufman told the Chicago Tribune, "Bettelheim's mind supplanted your own." And then we get to the very sad personal part of this essay. I was 23 when Bruno Bettelheim, a man I'd never heard of, took his own life. The following year, in 1991, my 3.5-year-old son, Andrew, lost language. One day he could talk, the next he was yodeling in a strange high-pitched voice, flicking the lights on and off and staring for hours as he spun a single wheel on a toy car. My then husband and I were too young and poor to have a child, much less two. Our 1-year-old had respiratory problems and asthma, which consumed time and money. We were on the edge, barely able to pay our bills and buy macaroni and cheese. It was just dawning on me that I'd married a dreamy, quixotic guy who drank when he was troubled and couldn't hold down a job. That's when county social workers saw when they were called to assess Andrew following his meltdown at our public library. A tiny house, a fraying marriage, 2 depleted parents in cheap clothes. It was winter on the Iron Range, where advances in psychology took some time to travel. The experts, a stoic North Country man and woman team, decided we were the cause. They questioned us separately and casually brought up the idea of temporary foster care. We protested and were told we could keep the boys, but only if we submitted to frequent visits and attended parenting classes twice weekly, which we gladly did. While we were being taught how to impose consequences and establish routine, Andrew and his brother were taken to a childcare room where teachers helped them sing, play, and socialize. At first, Andrew seemed to improve, brightening and even talking a bit, but then he regressed again, a pattern we'd see repeat on a loop for the rest of his life. When an older relative came to visit us in the spring, she took one look at my 4-year-old sitting in a corner, staring at his hand. "You ruined that beautiful child," she said, her face tense with fury. "You and your careless life ruined him. Aren't you ashamed?" We eventually moved to Minneapolis, where treatments were supposedly more advanced. At 5, Andrew was diagnosed with autism, enrolled in a program that involved rocking boards, chewy toys, and roughing his skin with surgical brushes 3 times a day. We blamed ourselves for our son's problems, and most of the new theories did too. His autism was because we'd had him vaccinated, because we'd fed him wheat or dairy or corn, because we hadn't employed a team of workers to have constant floor time with him, the so-called sunrise cure, or apply behavioral techniques according to the Lovaas method, beloved not only by late 90s autism parents, but also by conversion therapy folks. Each new wave was certain. The approaches to autism that had come before were barbaric and uninformed, but this most recent breakthrough was the one clear truth. Science had spoken over and over for a dozen years. We were heartbroken each time a treatment failed and guilty because without fail, someone would insist we hadn't tried hard enough. Sure, we'd gone gluten-free, but had we cleansed with hyperbaric oxygen? Behavioral training worked, but only if you did it 18 hours a day. Why hadn't we taken a second mortgage and flown to the Catskills for a workshop at the Sunrise Institute? Just shy of his 36th birthday, my then husband gave in and began drinking in earnest. He lost his job and grew dark and silent. One day he apologized, hugged us all, got in his truck, and drove away. Years passed, during which my sons grew closer and more alike. Once someone asked me which is the autistic one. But along with better engagement, social skills, and speech, Andrew had chronic anxiety. When he started high school, a doctor friend at the university where I was teaching suggested Andrew be seen. Around the same time, there was a surge in ads for antidepressants on TV. Psychiatrists quit asking questions and plumbing the unconscious mind, becoming like tea leaf readers in white coats who studied blood test results but never looked their patients in the eye. I took my son to such a person who prescribed Lexapro. Yes, Andrew responded oddly to Lexapro, as he did to so many things, becoming obsessive and manic, wandering all night. The boy's father had resurfaced with a new wife who happened to work for a pharmaceutical company. I, too, was recently remarried. The four of us met to discuss the situation, and I was relieved to have help for the first time in years. But soon we were at odds. My husband, John, and I wanted to take Andrew off the Lexapro, but my ex and his wife insisted he really needed something stronger. When we finally saw the autism specialist, we'd spent 6 months waitlisted for. He was entirely on their side. He put Andrew on Abilify, an atypical antipsychotic that ran commercials during the news. John and I asked for a trial of something milder or more tested, but the psychiatrist insisted older therapies were inferior and wouldn't work. Weeks later, my son turned 18 and I lost the power to control his medical decisions. I watched as the doctor and my ex-husband, both large, imposing men, insisted he take the drug. It's possible Andrew developed psychosis at exactly the same time he began taking psychiatric drugs, that my ex and the doctor were right and I was wrong. It's also possible that his brain was fragile and the drugs that were loaded into him over time, his doctor added Risperdal and a little Depakote, melted his circuitry, causing decompensation. And meanwhile, Andrew went from a shy, smart, autistic teenager to a stuporous man who gained 100 pounds and erupted in rage. My ex and his wife faded away around the time a county worker told a judge our son was out of control and the state of Minnesota mandated electroshock. This was 2011 and common practice. John and I sued and ended up with a court-appointed guardian who was granted all powers of control over Andrew's life and was later indicted for doping his clients and stealing from them. In 2014, John became Andrew's legal guardian and began the process of detoxing him from the most dangerous medications. For 2 years, we lived quietly, Andrew in an apartment complex for adults with autism, us in a small house we planned to will to him and his brother, who had asked to be successor guardian. Every Sunday, we had dinner together and took a walk. Andrew had grown into himself, resigned and weary, no longer angry. He lived in easy silence and aged precipitously, appearing decades older. When we went out, he and I, people assumed he was my husband, this tall, grave, balding man. On a dazzling Friday morning in November 2016, Andrew was found dead on the floor of his living room. John got the call and took me to a park near our house, awash with crisp red and orange leaves, to tell me the news. Fall has filled me with dread ever since. My son was 28 years old when he died. An autopsy was performed, but no official cause of death was found. Traditional methods of suicide were ruled out. Yet he told me at our last dinner that there was no happiness for him in this world, seeming clearer of mind than he had in years. He wiped his phone and computer and erased his music from Spotify. When we cleaned out his apartment, there was a pile of foil-wrapped pharmaceuticals in the back of a drawer. But the coroner's report showed low or normal levels of only 2 drugs in his blood, neither withdrawal nor overdose. My personal explanation is that he was tired of being controlled by the fickle SARS of autism, and he was just done. And so we get to the present day, and it all seems rather familiar to the author. Finally, the vaccines came, and they seemed at first to be a miracle, but still there were certain things you weren't allowed to discuss. Yes, I don't want to go into this, but she continues, whatever the experts said on television became reality because science. Meanwhile, people died and died and died, and just as the ongoing tragedy of autism of a child was somehow the mother's fault, over and over again, doctors and officials blamed their audience of 3 billion for the disease. The more the cures failed, the greater the fault of the public. The flaw was never in the remedy, but in those who failed to behave and thereby brought the plague among themselves. After schools were closed and our city shut down in March of 20, I lay awake nights imagining all the children like my son who were mute, sensitive, bound to routine, friendless, in desperate need of services, and incapable of learning on Zoom. The adults with already isolating disabilities whose programs and activities, supported jobs, and social work visits were canceled. The ones who were returned with COVID to their group homes and left to die. Occasionally I'd panic, my heart pounding, and my husband would awake to comfort me. Yes, but the experts are always right. Always right. And of course, if they say one thing today and they say a very different thing tomorrow, they were right then and they were right now. This is what we all must learn to accept. And let's take a look at the chat. Did I miss it, or what was the official reason for death? It seemed unclear. It's not what happens, it's how you take it, says Red Sulfur. Life is transitory, not worth killing yourself over anything that happens. Well, I don't know. I mean, I've talked many times about Nick Drake, the great guitarist and singer-songwriter, who unfortunately started smoking heavy amounts of marijuana when he was a teenager, which is poison to a depressive personality like his. And he stopped functioning. And so antidepressants were prescribed. And at the time of his death, at the age of 26, he was on 3 different drugs, 2 different antidepressants and 1 drug to control the side effects of the antidepressants, which included spasmodic twitching. I see a lot of ads on TV for this. Apparently, there are so many Americans suffering dreadful side effects of antidepressants that they need drugs to stop them twitching like someone with St. Vitus's dance. Well, I don't know that movie, the movie about the son who goes crazy with a bow and arrow, based on what was Lionel Shriver. That's the woman's name who wrote it. I noticed there that the autism, we have to talk about Kevin, it's called, both the novel and the movie. I noticed that the author seems to accept Bettelheim's thesis that it was the refrigerator mother who was responsible for her son becoming autistic and then becoming a mass murderer. She is shown to be, how will I say, not overwhelmed by happiness at the knowledge that she and her husband were going to have a child. And certainly in the movie, the child's alienation from life is apparent very, very early on, even as a baby. Okay. The Sicilian Red was pretty decent, said Red Sulfur. Added some Italian lemonade and made a sangria light last night. Great movie, says Palpcasso 88. And let's talk more about experts. I've been promising to talk about this for some time, but this is from Tinksorg at WordPress.com. And it is called Welcome to Jurassic Park. And again, it is about expertocracy. Recently, I was reminded of a movie I watched quite a few times during my childhood and that made quite an impression on me, indeed on a whole generation of people back in the day. Jurassic Park is one of the most successful movies of all time, setting the record for the highest grossing movie ever until Titanic surpassed it in 1997. Though the movie is excellent, the core message behind Jurassic Park isn't exactly subtle. Jeff Goldblum's character, the chaos theorist Ian Malcolm, goes on several rants to lay out his and the movie's point in great detail. That point is not actually a skepticism of technology, but rather a celebration of the natural world, summed up in the phrase, life finds a way. When matched against human reason, life wins. When pitted against human technology, life wins. It is the foolishness of thinking to master the natural world that is the core message, rather than the inherent brittleness in technological systems. This distinction might seem academic, but is in fact quite important to keep in mind. Jurassic Park was made in 1993, which was a time still suffused with optimism about technology. In one scene, the nerdy teenage girl manages to save the party of survivors from the encroaching dinosaurs by operating the Unix OS. The various parts of computer wizardry in the face of danger becomes a sort of metaphor for human ingenuity. The dinosaurs have claws and agility and killer instinct, and that is all well and good and worthy of respect. The humans have computers and smarts, so they should live as equals rather than to think to look down on the dinosaurs, who are just as much a part of the natural world as them. Again, 1993 was a technologically optimistic time. In Jurassic Park, technology fails, but this is mostly rationalized as technology having picked a fight it just shouldn't have picked. Nearly 30 years later, however, it is quite hard to watch that movie without noticing just how much technology, or perhaps more specifically, idiotic and needless complexity, really causes all problems in the movie, while the dinosaurs are in fact merely dumb animals, opportunistically taking advantage of the blithe lack of understanding on the part of the operators of the park. In that way, Jurassic Park might be a sort of confirmation, or at least a variant of the monkey with a typewriter thesis. If you make enough movies randomly about totally unrelated subjects, at least one of them will accidentally end becoming an incredibly prescient critique of the contemporary economy without ever intending to. Indeed, America is today locked into a logistical crisis that its rulers seem to be barely even aware of, never mind actually understand, and it closely mirrors the plot of this decade's-old classic. In 2021, Jurassic Park seems less a celebration of dinosaur life than a not very subtle parody of the stupidity and obliviousness of the current American elite. This might seem like a bit of a stretch to the reader at first blush, but if you actually recall what happens in the movie, you are likely to see some fairly eerie parallels to recap the story. A genetics company manages to clone dinosaurs from blood encased in amber with the aim of creating a theme park with dinosaurs. However, after a velociraptor escapes containment and kills a handler, the investors funding the park send a lawyer to investigate the park's safety. The park, in fact, turns out to be spectacularly, almost comically unsafe, as he soon discovers. The visionary owner of the park, John Hammond, decides to take the opportunity to bring along a small group of other people on this trip, including a paleontologist, a paleobiologist, the aforementioned Ian Malcolm, and two of Hammond's grandchildren. They're supposed to have a fun outing, see the park before it opens to the public, and not get eaten by dinosaurs. Unfortunately, the last part turns out to be a lot more tricky than anyone expected. As it happens, there is also a saboteur at the park, namely the contractor hired to debug the park's state-of-the-art computer systems, one Dennis Nedry, who is actually tasked by a rival company with stealing the DNA samples of the cloned dinosaurs. When we consider how Nedry does this and the fact that his attempts at industrial espionage essentially trigger the entirety of the crisis that nearly kills everyone in the cast, then we see some fairly humorous similarities to today. As it happens, Jurassic Park is meant to use its advanced computer systems in order to more or less eliminate the human element. Where have we heard that before? Instead of security guards, Jurassic Park just uses cameras and electronic surveillance. The cars used in the park tours aren't meant to have human drivers or tour guides. They are a very early form of the self-driving car. This predictably causes a lot of problems because that is obviously more efficient than having an actual human being giving the visitors their tour and answering any questions that the visitors may have. There is a catchphrase that is repeated by Hammond at several points in the movie that he spared no expense. At first, this is said enthusiastically as the visitors ooh and ah at all the fancy automated systems. By the end of the movie, the phrase is said in a solemn, self-deprecating tone as his guests are eating rapidly melting ice cream against a backdrop where the electrical systems have failed and several members of the cast have been murdered and eaten by the prowling dinosaurs. It is actually quite humorous to think about what Hammond sparing no expense actually means in context. In reality, it simply means that Hammond put no limit on the amount of money he spent on fancy automated systems, which then all fail, in order to then ludicrously underspend on all human elements involved in the actual running of the park. The hyper-complex Jurassic Park is thus very similar to the logistics system that underpins the American economy, and as it turns out, both systems made a point of relying on extremely complex solutions in order to employ as few people and have as little redundancy as possible. In fact, the only reason the two-legged humans even get added to the lunch counter menu at Jurassic Park is because the park turns out to be built with the capability of being run nearly automatically, while also being extremely susceptible to the same thing that is currently wrecking the global logistical system, a phenomenon that in systems theory is called a cascading failure. A failure cascade occurs when you have a system with interdependent nodes, and where the failure in one node causes malfunctions and failures to spread to other nodes, which then in turn spread that failure further. What makes failure cascades so dangerous is that the speed at which nodes fail increases exponentially due to the way the system is set up. As such, a problem in a single node can probably be repaired faster than the rate at which that problem will cause neighboring nodes to fail. Once several nodes go into the red, however, the system becomes, for all intents and purposes, unsalvageable. Any attempts to repair the parts of the system that stop working will quickly find themselves overwhelmed by the sheer speed at which failures multiply, and so the only way to fix such a system is to reboot it. That is, remove enough components from it that its parts stop breaking faster than you can repair it. There are at least two levels at which Jurassic Park is a fairly accurate metaphor for where the U.S. is today with its broken logistics system. One level is practical. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic was more or less the equivalent to Nedry's malicious behavior. In trying to shut down only parts of the extremely complex interconnected economy, U.S. politicians introduced a cascading series of failures and second-order effects that are now essentially playing haywire on the entirety of that economy and that aren't expected or even likely to be fixed soon. American just-in-time logistics has been built around every single part of it being there, unsurprisingly, just in time. If any point of the chain breaks, such as there being containers but no ships, ships but no longshoremen, longshoremen but no truckers, truckers but no truck frames but no trucks, trucks but no trains, and so on, the entire system quickly starts failing like a human body starved of oxygen. If there's not enough longshoremen in Long Beach, California, the ability of truck manufacturers to make spare parts for trucks will quickly disappear. Without spare parts for trucks, the ability to actually unload container ships will rapidly start to dwindle into nothing as the storage space gets filled up. As such, a rolling wave of shortages and blockages are currently playing havoc on many completely unrelated parts of the economy. Farmers can't get spare parts to run their farming equipment. Fast food chains in Florida can't get potatoes in order to make French fries. Usually, the individual problem or shortage can be fixed, but not before this failure has had time to create several second-order effects, which they can also be fixed, but not before they spread the contagion even further. I will note that yesterday I saw a TV ad for Best Buy, and they were advertising last-minute holiday gifts. So on November the 3rd, Best Buy was telling Americans that if they want their, laptops or whatever delivered for Christmas, which is on December the 25th, they had better act now. So yes, efficiency. It turns out that there can be too much efficiency, too much complexity, which of course is the point of Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies. And Tinksor concludes, if the supply crisis really was limited to the world that consumers see when they get to the supermarkets, this problem would be noticeable but not particularly threatening as these things go. If ordinary consumers simply had to deal with weeks of cornflakes being absent from the shelves, with granola being the only breakfast alternative on offer, the 2020s would likely go down as a golden age of Soviet-style jokes about going to the store. Unfortunately, farmers cannot do what consumers can. They can't deal with the fact that there are no more wheels for their combines by ordering a few extra wheels for their wheelbarrows. The real crisis of the American economy is currently spreading silently like a malignant cancer underneath the surface, and it is only briefly glanced in media headlines. It will not be solved for years and will continue to spread chaos all the while. That crisis is truly a regime-level problem, just as the bankruptcy of the French monarchy was in its day. And before that crisis is solved, the electrified fences keeping the dinosaurs docile and contained are very likely to fail. Whether the American elites can survive the rest of the movie, with a few lawyers getting eaten on the way, presumably, and make it to that helicopter at the end is anyone's guess. But our movie has in fact barely even begun, nor have the elites started to grapple with the depth of the problem facing them. There will be many twists and turns and moments of danger in the years ahead before anyone can truly breathe a sigh of relief. Welcome to Jurassic Park. And you can find this essay at tinkzorg, tinkzorg.wordpress.com. And I wanted to talk about election reliability. I noted some years ago that I just found it astonishing. Living in Canada, which is a very big country with people spread for thousands of miles in every direction. And, we have an election every few years. We're up to 338 seats, something like that. And the results are known quite reliably that same night. Whereas in Britain, oh no, the results aren't known for till the next day or maybe days. And how is that possible? Because it struck me, when I was following one British election, that this is going to induce suspicion about the legitimacy of the election. And this is the point that Alex Berenson has in an essay on his Substack. As I write this, media outlets have just declared that Phil Murphy has won New Jersey's race for governor. Murphy has less than a 1 percentage point lead, and a significant number of votes remain uncounted. Nonetheless, the Associated Press was eager to declare the election settled, no doubt in part because editors there knew that the longer it went without a declared winner, the more conspiracy theories would flourish. Other media outlets were happy to follow. Whether they would have done so equally fast if Jack Ciattarelli, the Republican, had won is a fine question, although irrelevant to this discussion. The broader issue is that it should not be the media's job to call a final winner in a very close race before election officials have counted all or substantially all of the votes. AP is stepping in because the authorities have failed to do their jobs in a timely manner, and these failures are happening more and more often. For generations, elections have generally been called and decided within hours after the polls closed, except in those rare cases when they genuinely were too close to call, where a mere handful of votes separated candidates, no more. Vote counting now routinely drags on for days, sometimes weeks. This is in sharp contrast to the trends for almost every other form of data. Tracking information has now become so easy and cheap that, for example, anyone can go online and watch every commercial flight in the United States in real time for free, or receive a notification of potential credit card fraud and instantly have the option to close the card. The failure of speedy vote counting may seem of interest mainly to journalists and political scientists. After all, the final counts do eventually arrive. But it is no small matter. It is profoundly dangerous. It erodes confidence both in the vote itself and in the state's basic ability to carry out its duties. If New Jersey cannot even determine who has won its highest office with clarity, precision, and speed, why would we trust it to do anything else? It is probably no coincidence that claims of stealing elections have surged since 2000, the first time since 1960 when the voting process itself could credibly have been said to affect a presidential election. Both the left and the right are now willing, if not outright eager, to make wild claims that elections will or are being stolen. Yes, the left too. And there's a headline from the week: Donald Trump is trying to steal the election. He's breaking democracy by breaking the post office. Berenson continues, so why did New Jersey fail? Not because turnout was overwhelming, though it was higher than normal for an off-year election. Not because of weather problems or other unforeseeable disasters. Our voting process has two core problems, one long-standing and one new. The old is that elections are run at the state, county, and city level, and some of these local authorities are, how do I put this nicely, more committed to transparency and speed than others. Not surprisingly, the old machine states in the Northeast and Midwest, where election boards have provided a steady but quiet source of patronage for generations, tend to be the worst. Still, the machine creaked along reasonably well until the federal move to allow and even encourage voting by mail. Personally, I don't think people should be allowed to opt out of voting in person without a documented medical reason. This is not an argument against early voting or weekend voting. I think voting should be as convenient as possible. But making people go to a centralized polling place where observers from both major parties and independents can watch the process is likely to discourage fraud. I am not saying widespread fraud happened in the 2020 presidential election, just that the risk seems higher, at least to me. But even without fraud, mail-in voting has changed our elections for the worse, especially in the machine states. They are struggling to adapt to the mailed ballots. Shocking, I know, that sleepy government bureaucracies are having difficulty with a major structural change. And some states have adopted rules that seem almost designed to make the counting as slow as possible. And here's a story from the New York Times. Why New York again trails almost all states in counting votes. A delay in tallying absentee ballots after Election Day follows a 6-week lag in declaring winners in 2 congressional primaries this summer. Berenson continues, so here we are. The process of elections is getting measurably worse at a real cost to public trust, and no one seems to care. Yes, and then he talks about the British Medical Journal article that made some accusations that I discussed yesterday. But again, with these mail-in ballots, obviously, most of them are going to be there. The vast majority are going to be there on Election Day. They could start counting ballots, these mail-in ballots, before the polls have closed. They could do that, you know. Now, someone will raise the objection that someone, people working at these places could then, divulge the media, the information to the media. But this information is already happening because of the interviews of voters after they leave the ballot boxes. And this information is readily available. There are, when voters are asked who the substantial numbers of voters are asked who they voted for, this information is tabulated. There are few surprises on Election Day anymore. But I don't know, cascading failures? You can't count votes anymore. You can't tabulate votes even with voting machines. These people are not fit for purpose, but it just seems to be getting worse and worse. And I'm not seeing many suggestions on how to improve this. And the longer people have to wait for definitive results of election contests, the more people are going to be suspicious of the process itself. An amusing story from New Jersey. This is from, this is from 6 ABC Action News. Actually, it's from the Associated Press. Longtime New Jersey Senate president loses to truck driver Ed Durr, dealing blow to Democrats. The New Jersey's longtime state Senate president, Democrat Steve Sweeney, lost re-election, falling to a Republican newcomer who spent little money and underscoring Democratic woes in the Biden era. The AP previously reported that Edmund Durr, a furniture company truck driver and first-time office holder, had spent $153 on his campaign, but has since changed the figure to $2,300 based on a new campaign finance report. It is stunning and shocking, and I cannot figure it out, said Senate Majority Leader Loretta Weinberg. Could have something to do with the lockdowns in New Jersey, strictest in the nation. Could have something to do with that. And oh yes, let's indulge in a little Schadenfreude, shall we? Always fun. This is from Amanda Prestigiacomo at the Daily Wire. Meltdown, a collection of the most insane tweets from election night. Guess what? Why did the Democrats do so poorly? White supremacy. Yeah, it's agreed. Gemily Hill, who's a sportscaster, or used to be. It's not the messaging, folks. This country simply loves white supremacy. Professor Crunk, a.k.a. Brittany Cooper, who earns $112,000 a year teaching at Rutgers, tweeted, "White supremacy is indefatigable. That truth is both personal and political this week. Long way of saying I'm tired." Oh, they're just exhausted. They're all so exhausted. Funny, they don't act as if they are exhausted. They just never stop moving and talking, which is generally not a sign of exhaustion. Cher, who always tweets in block capitals for some reason, "Joe works tirelessly to work with Congress and pass bills to help everyday Americans, and he's hit from Dems on right and left. They cause gridlock while GOP sit and plan how to pick our bones clean if we fail. GOP are Nazis in lockstep. It's difference between democracy and dictatorship." Mona Eltahawy, who for some reason, well, she has problem glasses and purple lipstick and purple hair, which is brushed straight up like, Eraserhead. And this is her avatar on Twitter. She has chosen to make herself look like a demon, because that's what I guess smart people do these days. And she had tweeted, "White women voters are foot soldiers of white supremacist patriarchy. In their majority, they voted GOP long before Trump because they benefit from white supremacy and they undergird right-wing populism as voters and candidates." There was hardly any right-wing populism on the electoral level at all in the GOP before Donald Trump. That's why his victory for the nomination was so shocking. It was supposed to be another Bush or little Marco Rubio or whoever. Who else do we have here? Kimberly Johnson said, "The fact this Virginia election is close, Youngkin offered no political strategy. He ran on Trumpism, on banning CRT from grade school. Even though they don't teach it in grade school, it's all racism. White supremacism is ugly." Well, as Christopher Rufo has discovered, they do teach CRT in Virginia schools. "White supremacy is so ugly," Kimberly Johnson continues, "and watching so many white people defend it, fight for it, or just accept it because they are personally affected by it makes my stomach churn." Who's Kimberly Johnson when she's at home? She is the host of the Start Me Up podcast, Books, Peyton's Choice, and The Virgin Diaries, HuffPost Sexy Liberal Podcast Network. Her avatar, she looks a little superannuated, Leslie Mack says, "because we are that committed to white supremacy. It's important to say the things." Leslie Mack also has unnatural hair, which is brushed straight up like Eraserhead and is colored bright orange. I see that you're blocked. I'd never heard of this woman until just now, but I'm blocked anyway. Olivia A. Cole tweeted, "White women are thrilled to have a cause in our lane that we can throw ourselves behind. CRT panic in which we can wring our hands about white children and obfuscate our white supremacy. This is what white women have done best since the 50s and will continue to do." She is the author of The Truth About White Lies, which is coming out in 2022. Olivia Cole's The Truth About White Lies about a 17-year-old white girl who moves to the gentrifying town of Blue Rock and reckons with her role in racism in her new town, as well as the historical and present-day effects of white supremacy and the danger in silence, to be published by Little Brown. Sounds thrilling. Can hardly wait to read it. Let's see. Soraya Nadia McDonald, a culture critic for The Undefeated, tweeted, "White supremacy got that ultimate snapback." What does that mean? "Folks got a tiny glimpse, a lot of eyes there, into what it would take to right the ship, and they chose their own comfort again." Well, you know what? People are likely to choose their own comfort rather instead of being ruled by this Soraya woman who has a shaved head, which people find off-putting. They associate it with derangement, like Britney Spears. Dean Obadiah, however you pronounce. Dear media, Republican voters are not excited by the issue of education. Republican voters are excited by the issue of white supremacy. Various reasons for Glenn Youngkin's win. Oh, I see. He's claiming that the election was stolen. But no, it's impossible to steal elections in America. This was established after the 2020 presidential election. Various reasons for Glenn Youngkin's win in Virginia include, one, white supremacy is still very powerful. People wanted encoded language while wearing a fleece. Two, media hammered Dems gave Youngkin a pass on racist critical race theory. And three, Dems better counter the CRT BS. I quoted Lenin yesterday, accentuate the contradictions. Yes, keep saying this, progressives. Keep blaming, every time you break a shoelace, blame it on white supremacy. Okay? Every time your burger arrives, undercooked or cold, must be white supremacy. Just keep this up and see where it gets you. And, in Canadian news, the never-ending story, this is by John Iveson of the National Post. The government will raise the maple leaf on federal buildings in time for them to be lowered to half-staff to honor Canada's war dead on Remembrance Day, according to a senior Liberal source. Justin Trudeau hinted that a resolution was imminent this week when he said the government is working with Indigenous groups to find ways to raise and then lower the flag next week. I am confident that the conversations with Indigenous leadership on making sure we lower the flag again on November the 11th will come to the right solution, Trudeau said. Flags have been flown at half-staff on the Peace Tower and other federal buildings since May 30th as a mark of respect, following the discovery of 215 unmarked graves. Untrue. Bullshit. We don't know whether there are any dead people under the ground outside the former residential school at Kamloops, BC. We don't know this because there's been no exhumation, and the tribal leaders say there won't be an exhumation because that would be disrespectful. Trudeau told reporters during the recent election campaign that flags would remain at half-staff until it is clear that Indigenous peoples are happy to raise them again. This was interpreted as a sign that Indigenous communities would have to give consent to the federal government before the flags were raised. But a government source said this is not the case. We're not seeking unanimous consent, the source said. Instead, Ottawa is in the process of informing Indigenous leaders like the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Roseanne Archibald, regional chiefs, and the Survivors Circle of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, so they are not blindsided. This is treason we are talking about. Canada does not belong to so-called Indigenous people. It belongs to Canadians. And what else we got here? Oh, yeah. Let's talk about this. This is by Richard Greenhorn at the American Sun. Oh, don't think too much about it. Anything can cause it. It might have been the storm, the drop in barometric pressure. It might be the full moon. The other nurses nodded along to this proposed explanation for why my son, who wasn't supposed to be born for another 6 weeks, had arrived in the world that early morning. It was a relief to hear such talk. At that time, I was surrounded by the sterile walls, whirring motors, beeping electronics. My son was attached to a CPAP machine, his little face knotted up by Velcro straps, keeping the air tubes in his nose. One of his little hour-old veins was extended in an IV tube, and all his bodily functions seemed to be taking place on a screen. When your firstborn son looks like a bit of techno-horror, you are grateful for that hokum, which is as old as the hill's old wives' tale. If it were nothing but old wives' tales, fluffing pillows and changing diapers, I doubt I would like anything more than nursing. The problem is the job that properly belongs to nuns and old widows has been turned into a profession. Nursing is now maybe the most noticeable part of the mommy industrial complex, that part of the feminist revolution which transforms maternal impulses into cogs of the technocracy. A gaggle of nurses is a dangerous thing. Through our next 2 weeks in the NICU, my wife and I learned and relearned this again and again. What is interesting is not the malevolence or incompetence of any one nurse, but their wickedness as a corporeal body. If you were dealing with one individual nurse, it would be a whole different affair. If that one nurse made a mistake or did something the baby didn't respond well to, you could point it out to her and she could do better the next time. But the nurses revolve after 8 to 12 hours. Then you don't see the same one again for another couple of days, if at all. By the time you notice one nurse's error, another nurse has stepped in, possibly ready to make the same error, in which case she will be ready to chew you out for suggesting she is like the previous nurse and very likely to make new errors of her own. Every NICU nurse has a very clear idea of what is undoubtedly in the best interest of your baby. This very clear idea is never the same from nurse to nurse. One claims that skin-to-skin contact is the best thing for your preemie. The next says it will do a world of harm in such a new state. One tells you that any breastfeeding is going to stand in the way of growth. The next tells you it is the best way for preemies to grow. If you were dealing with one person, you could ask her questions. You could try to figure out what kind of logic or logical error was involved in a given prescription. But the constant revolution of nurses means you never have any consistency, not even in error. There is the doctor. I like the doctor. You see the doctor once a day for about 5 minutes. Even when he's leading you down a course of action you or your wife don't completely agree with, the doctor gives you assurance that his treatment program is based somewhat in science and logic. But doctors don't run hospitals. No one runs hospitals. No one knows who runs hospitals. Even the people who run the hospitals probably aren't aware they run it. Some bigwig occasionally makes a statement about profits and federal funding, and it slithers down the machinery of the corporate bureaucracy. But assigning rationality or even malevolence to the actors obscures the fact that probably no one is in charge. There are many facts taken alone which would themselves provide ample excuse to blow the medical establishment to smithereens. One is that newborn babies within 24 hours of birth, even preemies, are encouraged to take a vaccine for hepatitis B. Hepatitis B, that disease that doesn't affect anyone but crack whores, it is so mind-bogglingly stupid, so blatantly and outrageously a scam, that you can't believe an actual human being would suggest it without laughing. And yet a nurse comes in and does just that. And when you tell that nurse your baby will not be getting the Hep B vaccine, that he is at no risk for Hep B and therefore has no use for it, she will invariably get angry at opposing hospital policy. Is hospital policy to give the newborns heroin? Nurses don't like it when you ask such questions. On the third day in the NICU, one of the nurses told me that my wife needed to be tested for syphilis. It might have been one of the reasons the baby came so early, and she might have passed it on to the baby. My wife most certainly did not have syphilis. I told the nurse this. Well, of course, I know your wife doesn't have syphilis, she said, but the hospital's standard of care was involved. Standard of care is not a medical term, of course. It's one out of tort law. Medical professionals are supposed to be concerned with care. That is the actual treatment provided to an individual, not a standard of care, which is the broad limit of incompetency a medical professional must maintain before he gets sued. I told the nurse neither my wife nor child would be getting tested, that she herself didn't believe syphilis was a threat, and that I would trust her judgment and common sense rather than let us be guided by idiot bureaucrats and lawyers. This was meant as a compliment to her and her competency, but nonetheless, we were known as the difficult family. That was the amazing thing about nurses. Even when you flatter them, even when you refer to their individual expertise and opinions against notoriously absurd hospital policy, they get mad at you for failing to conform. Don't they resent having to promote policies that fly in the face of logic and medical knowledge? Don't they resent that their organizations place so very little emphasis on the competency of their staff? No, they don't at all. They don't have a healthy pride in their work. Nurses have a pride of their place in the system. They are individual professionals hired by the hospital to perform a task. They are members of the hospital's harem, striving to be the favored wife. It's been fascinating to see how quickly and illogically Corona doom policy has changed these past 2 years. Masks don't work, then they do. This couldn't happen if the medical community were full of people with any sense of professional responsibility. The nurses don't have any. The administrators definitely don't have any. Even the doctors are a strangely subservient crew, given that they are members of a profession that prides itself on independence. Not as strange when you consider how many are holding green cards. One of the great signs of civilization, perhaps it is synonymous with civilization, is being able to feel confident in trusting some task to the competency of others. but the entire medical establishment is just a blob of received opinion and regurgitated standards of care. This couldn't be confused with any traditional hierarchical model, because in traditional hierarchies, orders flow down and information flows up. The CDC is a quasi-shamanistic institution whose jurisdiction over anything isn't totally clear. They put out guidelines, which are obviously corrupt, and which anyone with any professional responsibility has a duty to disobey. The Hep B nod, for example, was the result of certain board members being paid off by Merck, and literally no one caring. The mind recoils to think the system could continue along without some reform. Even the Soviet Union had a glasnost. But then you realize the nurses, they are the true believers interspersed within, keeping the moribund system going. They are the ones who eagerly snap up Dr. Fauci's guidelines and want nothing more to prove themselves obedient to the forces above them. They are a class unknown in history, sterilized, spinsterish, unexceptionable, worshipped as the height of virtue. They are not just taking home paychecks, they are validating the system with their girl power. Their entire motive for existing lies in conforming themselves to this system. The faceless, credentialed mediocrities give the tenor and tone to all society. This is government by harem. Yes, I have 3 children, and 2 of them were born severely underweight, such that they had to spend about 4 weeks in an incubator. So I ended up spending a lot of time in the hospital. And I discovered, to my great irritation, that the nurses seemed to believe that you were there to serve them and not the other way around. Frequently found that the hospital seemed to be deserted, except for patients, because the nurses all insisted on taking their breaks together. Now, when I was working for Alberta Report, and Premier Ralph Klein instituted a 5% cut across the board, the nurses did not like this, not one little bit, with the result that the Edmonton Journal and the Calgary Herald were full of horror stories about Ralph Klein, that patients, often elderly patients, were in bed covered with their own urine and feces because of Ralph Klein. No, because the nurses decided not to clean up after patients in order to make a political point. I suppose it was around that time that I started seeing an advertisement that said, "Doctors don't keep you alive, nurses do," and a chill went down my spine. Clearly, the message was, don't get on the wrong side of us, or we can kill you, or just, let you die. More recently, one of my siblings has spent a great deal of time in hospital, and I've heard many horror stories from him, to wit, that he's quite fond of his physicians, but the nurses, again, we're dealing with someone who is exceedingly debilitated. And the nurses seem to believe that he is there to please them and not the other way round. Let's have a look at the chat before I move on to Theater Thursday. Brandon Smith says, no group has more contempt for mankind than nurses. Okay, policy, never have they uttered such a foul word, says Chogokin 666. Hello to I, Judas Fly Chai. Oh, we're talking about boots here. Neil Terry says it's like a psychotic competition to see who can go to the greatest, most stunningly absurd lengths to cloak virulent contempt for one group as compassion for another. My trail of disgrace says Trudeau just succeeds in becoming more and more vile and more abrasive with each passing day. Well, I asked the question. It was clear in the election 2 years ago that the Canadian public was fed up. And the majority was fed up with Trudeau. And they were even more fed up with him in the election last month. So why did the Liberals manage to, win enough seats to form a minority government? Well, here's the reason that the media won't tell you. Because the Liberals and the Conservatives, in their blithe stupidity, have imported millions of third worlders to Canada. And these people are going to vote overwhelmingly against the Conservative Party. So, we're close to the position in Canada where, as currently constituted, the Conservative Party will never be able to win another election. Little Brown used to be a respectable publisher, notes Dan Allison. Okay, so let us move on to Theater Thursday, and I'm going to be talking about a television series which is called Babylon Berlin, and it is 3 men are responsible for it: Tom Tykwer, Achim von Boris, and Hendrik Handlukten. I know of Tom Tykwer. I'm quite fond of his movie Run Lola Run. And he made a movie out of a script which was written but was never able to be filmed by the great Krzysztof Kieslowski, called Heaven. He likes strange subjects. Perfume is, it's by Patrick Süskind. It's a very strange subject indeed. And of course, there is Cloud Atlas, which I sometimes have to, remind myself that thing actually exists. It was directed, 3 directors, the Wachowski sisters, formerly the Wachowski brothers, and Tykwer, based on David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas. There's a great joke about this in the HBO series Silicon Valley, that the Pakistani Denzel, meets some cute woman at a computer fair. She's just really cute, perky blonde. She's got a little streak in her hair, like a purple streak in her blonde hair. And they become friends, and he is under the illusion that she is actually a coder and she is a PR person. She writes the tweets. He doesn't know this till too late. And so she invites him to her hotel room to watch Cloud Atlas. And the other members of the Pied Piper say, well, no, she definitely wants to have sex with you. Well, how do you know that? And they say, no one has managed to make it more than 5 minutes through Cloud Atlas. But Babylon Berlin is very watchable indeed. Let me read from a description, official description of it, that was published by the authors in German. Berlin, 1929. Commissioner Gerion Rath is transferred from Cologne to the center of the Reich capital. But the facade of the Roaring Twenties begins to crumble, and soon he finds himself in a den of sin, of corruption, organized crime, and burgeoning National Socialism. Nobody suspects how close the young Weimar Republic is to the abyss. For a long time, it was said that Germany could not produce internationally successful series. After the German Netflix hit Dark, there is another striking counter evidence with Babylon Berlin, a 40 million euro project. The series has already been sold in over 90 countries, and according to The Hollywood Reporter, Netflix has already secured the U.S. broadcasting rights. Babylon Berlin, based on Volker Kutscher's novel, Der Nasse Fisch, is dedicated to one of the most wicked and at the same time longing decades in German history, the 1920s. The camera pulls the viewer into the opulently staged past of Berlin, from the streets where the Prussian police and communist demonstrators fight each other, through the dilapidated backyards into the nightclubs where sweaty bodies indulge in the Charleston. According to Dublin, the metropolis is reminiscent of the whore Babylon from the Bible, called the mother of sins, who puts the audience and characters in a frenzy that will not end well. That would be the novelist Alfred Dublin. This dance on the volcano is particularly memorable through the appearance of the androgynous singer Nikaros, who is played by a Lithuanian woman whose name I cannot possibly pronounce, in the Mocha FD nightclub. Her hypnotic song, Zu Asche, zu Staub, is reminiscent of Hildegard Knef, and her appearance is reminiscent of a man with a dark mustache who would take power 3 years later. Nikaros drives the crowd into ecstasy. As if in a trance, the whole hall moves in step with her chanson. Even as a viewer, one cannot escape the visual violence of this scene. But suddenly the mass choreography mutates into a sequence of military gestures and the right arms shoot up in unison. So one realizes again that only 3 years later, the National Socialists forcibly gained control over Germany and later over large parts of Europe. How could this happen? The question is omnipresent like a gray veil over the entire series. Despite impressive images and thought-provoking scenes, the characters remain cool and aloof for the viewer. Whether war flashbacks or interaction with a suitor, the facial expressions and gestures of the protagonists hardly change. You maneuver your way through the Berlin underworld with a steel facade as if every honest emotion could mean its downfall. As a result, the viewer does not find any real figure to identify with. You hardly suffer when Rat is beaten up again or a Charlotta has to prostitute herself. Babylon Berlin doesn't really manage to get around the cliches and overdrawings either. Cattle are cut up in the grotesquely disgusting backyards, while next door the massively overweight mother washes herself briefly with a dry rag under her skirt before, and I'm not going to read the rest of that sentence. You shouldn't have a drinking game with typical Berlin phrases like Icha and Kiekma, and the question of whether poverty always has to mean dirty arises in almost every scene. The lived faces play the underworld thugs, the greasy politicians or porn directors, and everyone who looks like a National Socialist turns out to be such. Babylon Berlin gives us sperm, blood, and lots of dirty faces, so every cliche that one expects when it is said that a man comes to the city of sin, but only almost everything, because there are no deep emotions and sensual pleasures, but it is this stylistic coldness that gives the viewer the opportunity to observe, like in a petri dish, what could lead to one of the worst genocides in human history. It is precisely this question that makes the series more relevant today than ever. Loss of confidence in politics, the threat to European unity, and the rise of right-wing populism, words that are still on the news today. Babylon Berlin holds up a sharpened mirror to the present. Götterdämmerung is inevitable for Gerion Rat. But the viewer cannot rest on his omniscient position, because Babylon Berlin captivatingly reflects our times and urges us to be vigilant. So it's curious to note that Tom Tykwer said in an interview that he doesn't want people to get the impression from the show that, that Weimar era Berlin was so great. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? It's the opposite of the impression that I got. It's overwhelming in its depravity. And one wonders, exactly how many, well, I've never really wondered this, but it's been, pointed out. I mean, how many different specialties can be on the menu, from prostitutes, female or male? It appears that in, the Berlin of Weimar, there were perhaps hundreds of different ones. Such was the depravity of the population. And now, meanwhile, you still have these really aching contrasts of just grinding, dire, hopeless poverty and opulence. I know it's a cliche, but it's powerful because it is true. And certainly in the first 2 seasons of the show, it's a mistake to this is about National Socialism, because at first, the communists were the most powerful threat to the Weimar Republic. They had already attempted to take over Germany, and it was clear that if the communists took over, liberty would vanish. That it was already known what was going on in the Soviet Union, and the German communists wanted the same in Germany. And so, one of the great tragedies of Weimar Germany is that it's the tragedy of liberalism, of the Enlightenment. I mean, properly, both the Communist Party and the Nazi Party should have been banned. But Weimar Germany was not willing to do that, because that would be illiberal. I should mention that some of the actors, Volker Bruch plays Gerion Rat. A great resemblance to John Hamm, seems to me. Garion is the patron saint of the city of Köln or Cologne, and his father is the chief of police, and he has a secret sadness to do with World War One. Appears that many people in this series, in the show, as in real life, had secret sadnesses or just outright sadnesses associated with the slaughter of World War One. That is to say that Garion Rat, he has this idea in his head of struggling to save his older brother during a battle near the end of the war, and then his brother disappears. And it is only many episodes later that we discover the truth of what had happened, and he becomes involved. It's unclear exactly when, with his sister-in-law, and this is incest, of course. And Garion Rat is he's very guilty about this. And there is a child. His sister-in-law has a child, and so the child wises up pretty soon as to pretty early as to what was going on in the household after his father doesn't come back. Garion Rat is a Catholic, and if there's a particular failing of this show, there's very little with regard to religion in it. And Germany at the time was overwhelmingly a Christian country. Whether majority Lutheranism or Catholicism and other branches of the Christian faith. We get very little of this. We get lots and lots about politics and lots about sex, but very little about religion. One of Garion Rat's rivals in the police force in Berlin is shown as a Catholic, shown as an observant Catholic, and he turns out to be a very greedy man indeed, who has mortgaged his future to the stock market. That clearly, this has been building up for years, that impossible promises have been made to people. Well, the stock market, it can only go up. I should point out that Irving Fisher, considered one of the greatest liberal economists, he said this in 1929. The stock market can't go down. It can only go up. This was not long before the crash. And Gideon Rat's Catholic rival, well, the crash happens. Now, we see Garion Rat, we see him in the confessional. We see him in church in the beginning, in fantasy scene, the wedding of his brother's wedding. We see him in the confessional, and he says to the priest that he has become involved with his sister-in-law. And the confessor, as confessors do, presses on him. He needs more information, and Garion decides to bail at this point. And the priest says, "No, we want to help you. Please come back. We're always ready to hear from you when you want to be reconciled to God." There is another priest in this show. It's a very strange character and is not explained at all. It makes no sense at all. There is this priest who wears the hat of a Monsignor. And this is an honorific, which comes from the Vatican. We see he's this big, burly, bolshy figure, and we see that his hand is covered almost entirely with a tattoo. And no, priests don't have tattoos. Later we see that, well, his entire body, or at least the upper part of his body, is covered with tattoos. And he's a gangland enforcer. Josef Vilcek, he's called in the show. And again, it's not really explained whether he is a real priest or pretending to be a priest, how pretending to be a priest would ingratiate one with the criminal underground? That's an interesting question. Now, cliches. Gary and Rat's original boss, Bruno Volter. He is on the take, and lots of prostitutes, as previously mentioned, lots and lots of good-looking young women, and he certifies whorehouses and takes advantage of this to sample the best. But he is again seemingly devoted to fighting crime, like Vic from The Shield. He's very much a character like Vic from The Shield. And to what extent are the Berlin police themselves corrupted? Well, one of the things you find in Babylon Berlin is that everyone is corrupted in Berlin, and it's rather distressing in season 3, where at first his sister-in-law tried to get him to return to Cologne, and he had a task. And the task has to do with a rather scandalous revelation about Konrad Adenauer, which I'm certain is made up for the purposes of this series. And his father eventually wants him to come back to Cologne, and he says, no, I'm not going to do that because life is not real in Cologne. So apparently Gary Rath has become so corrupted himself that Cologne is just too goody-goody for him now, and that's not the way a normal person thinks. I'll warn possible viewers, if you haven't seen this before, that the series begins with sacrilege, just a religious pornography. Okay, religious pornography involving the Holy Family, which was rather hard to take, but you get thrown in the deep end right at the very beginning. Now, how much simulated sex is there in this? More than I'd like, but less than other shows like HBO's Rome or Game of Thrones. I find, simulated sex, it's pornography, and I don't see the point of, it seems to me that pornography and art are antithetical, but I guess it's just, it's irresistible now. Much of this sex involves Charlotte or Lotte Ritter, who is played by Liv Lisa Fries. And she is trying to earn enough money to support her whole family, her mother, her father, her sister's child, another sister, and her sister's thuggish and feckless husband, who mocks her for her prostitution, but this is the only money coming into the household. Lotte is played by an actress called Liv Lisa Fries, who is quite an attractive woman, and she wants to become a police inspector. There's a feminist aspect to this. One of the other coppers says after a scene where her family shows up at the police department, that he says this is exactly why women should not be policemen. And seeing this, I thought, yeah, I've got to side with him here. She is a very intelligent woman, and she's really indefatigable because she suffers a great deal in this series. And I have to say, she is an excellent crier. She does a lot of weeping on Babylon Berlin. There's a lot of impressive women in this show. Let's see, Leonie Benesch, who plays Greta Overbeck, she's a pretty girl. She's rather the opposite to Lotte Ritter. She is profoundly stupid, and her stupidity ends up causing tragedy and death. I have to say that there is a woman, a communist leader, who's a sort of burly, burly blonde with braids, buxom, you could say. She's a detestable communist, but on the other hand, um, she's really formidable and rather inspires admiration. I mentioned previously the Lithuanian actress. What is it? Sferia Janish-Auskaite. I probably got that wrong. She is just a sensation in this, an absolute sensation. She just dominates the screen whenever she is on it. And in terms of singing, a lot of music in this, and I'm quite fond of the, let's say, the jazzy compositions, of Kurt Weill during the 1920s. And there's a lot of original music in the show, and it is all good. And there's a lot of Brian Ferry in Babylon Berlin as well. And as you know, Brian Ferry has long been one of my favorites. And there are sort of, papa versions of Roxy music songs. And we actually see Byron Ferrari, as they used to call him, up on the stage, the Mocha FT, charming the crowd. This depravity seemed to be associated with the elegance in those days, far more than it is today. This film, Babylon Berlin, well, I want to say some things about Gary and Rat. He has very poor trigger discipline. He loses control of his weapon. I think we're now up to him losing control of his weapon 4 times, which suggests that he's really not such a good policeman. Another cliche in Babylon Berlin, the person who just won't die. People take a tremendous beating. Many people suffer the kind of injuries, repeated injuries, that would lead to brain damage or death, but that doesn't happen. And I rather thought that by season 3, they were rather pushing this aspect of it. Also, the pushing of homosexuality. We see that Lotta, she doesn't mind having sex with girls, and there is a photographer, a staff photographer, who is a homosexual and a transvestite. Let's see, his Bertolt Greff, played by Christian Friedel, and he's a very brave fellow. He proves his bravery again and again, including a scene where he and Rat fly into the Soviet Union, where Germany is secretly training the Luftwaffe in violation of treaty accords. And there are some absolute hair-raising scenes of what the lengths that de Bertolt has to go in order to get his shots. I am not. Oh, okay. So we have a homosexual who's who's depraved, but he turns out to be a brave man. That's not really shocking to me, but it seemed to me that by season 3 they were really pushing this hard. And I as I say, there's enough sex in this already. As the series goes on, there seems to be more, simulated sex, which I do not want to see, as previously mentioned. Now, there's a curious character who has been applied a very large strawberry birthmark to his face in order to, a sort of mark, a mark of Cain or whatever. And he is the scion of large industrialist families. They called him Nissen. Alfred Nissen is played by Lars Eidinger. And he's a mystical character. And his mother, says, the wrong son came back from the war, and his mother treats him as a joke. But he is not, in fact, a joke. And he has several of the characters in Babylon Berlin. They believe that the Weimar Republic is wicked, is weak and wicked, and must be replaced. Some of them want to return to the monarchy, and then they enter into kind of a devil's pact with the National Socialists. They consider them to be thugs, because the street fighters of the SA, well, they are thugs. Now we have the story of Horst Wessel, of the famous Lied. It's shown in this, but they don't call him a Horst Wessel. And there are many other examples of this. Louise Brooks. Louise Brooks was an American actress. I believe she was from Kansas, who went to Germany, and she worked as an actress for G.W. Pabst. And she was the flapper of the Jazz Age, and her haircut, with the black hair, combed straight forward, the bangs almost to the eyebrows, short just over the ears. You see a very favorite haircut of mine, and you see a great deal of it in Babylon Berlin. It's the transformation of a lot of these women, when women who would say have blonde hair, and then they give them the Louise Brooks wig. The transformation is really remarkable, and you get the feeling, watching Babylon Berlin. It's alternative history, really, but there's so much in it that that actually happened, just very slightly changed. There's also, as far as cliches go, there is the cliche of the police inspector who owes a favor to a criminal overlord, and we have that too. I have no doubt that sort of thing went on frequently during the Weimar Republic in Berlin. I have to say that the presentation of this series, from the opening credits to the use of existing buildings and CGI to recreate the Berlin of the 1920s, 1929 specifically, it's really breathtaking. I mean, one really gets the impression that we are seeing the Berlin of 1929, and of course, a great deal of the Berlin of 1929 was destroyed during World War II. I really like this show. I binge watched it about 3 weeks ago. I was sort of bullied into watching it. David Pinson and a friend of mine, who I'll just call Daniel, were two of the people. Have you watched Babylon Berlin yet? I get this all the time from people. I'm sure you have too. And you think, okay, all these people say this show is great, but how do I know that it is? Do I really want to invest 60 hours in this or whatever? Well, I invested 28 times 45 minutes of my life into it, and it is, I say, the best long-form TV series that I have seen in years. So that is my verdict on Babylon Berlin. So a final look at the chat. Contra Q says in 2020, the number of mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania increased by 2,000% compared to previous years, far more than any other state. I won't talk about it, but Donald Trump had published, a few days ago, a letter to the editor where he talked about Pennsylvania in painstaking detail, and it's a very powerful critique. And, well, good night to you, Don Willis. Ashley Bravo says, I wondered what was a typical meal that Schopenhauer ate. British American says Schopenhauer certainly wouldn't approve of the food porn that is so rampant today. I like eating. I like food. But it is food porn. Food to me is a lot like sex. That is to say, it's all of a kind. They're pretty much all of a kind. And that, oh, yes, this particular meal. Oh, you remember that one particular meal that you had at some restaurant 2 years ago? Really? Do you? I don't think so. I really don't. There's so many cooking shows on television, and most of them are useless. I used to watch, I'm not really a cook, but I used to watch this show, I think it might have been on PBS, with Julia Child and the French chef Michel Petit. It was actually useful, teaching you things that were useful about cooking. I don't want to see shows where people are given 5 minutes and a bunch of random ingredients to make something. How is that useful? You got to do it by 5 minutes. Everything has to be turned into a contest today. British American says aesthetic focus on food is peak decadence. I agree, actually. In my lifetime, most things have gotten worse, but food has definitely got better. But no, we weren't prepared simply to be pleased that food has gotten better. We have to fetishize food now. Ashley Bravo says, is KMG pro men going their own way? No, not really. Men need helpmeets. That's why God created Eve, Obviously, tremendous imbalances, unnatural distinctions in the relations between men and women today. I touched on that when I was discussing that essay by Mary Harrington in Unheard, that men and women are not meant to go their own way. Chad Chadson, our valiant moderator. Thank you for your service. Says, my great-great-grandmother was a flapper, and she used to tell us stories about it. Metal Mike says, KMG, you're eligible to get your booster shot now. Great news. British American says, buxom, you say. Now you've got my attention. Jonathan Paul says, Yakuza, Catholic priest. Dionysus says, KMG is right. Sex and art are antithetical. Sex is concerned with the will, whereas art is concerned with the intellect. Professor Paul says there is also the fact that between 1918 and 1933, the Soviet government with a Jewish-dominated Cheka, GPU, OGPU, NKVD murdered some 500,000 ethnic Germans in Ukraine, the Volga, and other regions. Wasn't Berlin a pretty left-wing city, said Yo Mama. It's true, but we see this tension. One thing that, Hitler was very smart about was that if communists decided that they would rather, join the SA, join the Nazi party, he said, that's great. You people are trained. You're used to following an ideology. You're fighters. And we see the SA moving into a particularly left-wing district in Berlin, in Babylon, Berlin. And, we see this, this pimp who fancies himself, a politician in some way. Oh, no, Nazis stay out. Well, the Nazis were, I know this is a very deep argument, which I've had with, Paul Gottfried and others, but the Nazis were a left-wing party. The Nazis were anti-tradition. Practically in every sense of the word, they were anti-tradition. And so the Nazis were a very strong rival to the Communist Party because, of course, they were a nationalist party, whereas the communists are an internationalist party. And the Germans used to be a quite nationalistic people. So a party that combines nationalism with populism is obviously going to be popular in Germany, in Germany, in Berlin. Professor Paul says the NS got a plurality of the Reichstag seats in the 1932 elections, and then Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor, but maybe they're referring to the Enabling Act. Well, Carl Schmitt, lamented that the Weimar Republic had the means to defend itself against the extremists and did not. It did not. Okay. Emma Kelly-Zer said, if only the Cap putsch had succeeded, the world would be a better place. So let's look at what is coming up on Theater Thursday next week. Hang on, just give me a second here. Theater Thursday next week, Homicide by David Mamet from 1991. It's a very strange movie that toys with reality or our understanding of reality. And on the book club tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about a symposium written by the great reactionary Joseph de Maistre. It's called The Executioner. And on Music Monday, November the 8th, I'm going to be talking about the cult of the performer. That the greats of classical music, they were players. They played, but they composed as well. And I suppose it was about the time that, serialism began taking over, that you got this radical division between composers and artists. And no matter how great Long is, to give one example, it seems to be absurd to accord him more attention and more plaudits than, say, Franz Liszt. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you would like to make a donation to the live stream, which, frankly, I could desperately use right now, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, have managed to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.